Welcome back to The Watch. And what did I just watch? House of Dragons, Episode 1. I'm the only one who ended up watching it, so solo review for me at the moment. And this is the thing. It wasn't terrible. In actual fact, I would even say it's on the side of being not too bad. It's actually good. Shock horror. Now, this is early days, all right? It's the first episode. I have been burnt before when looking at a series positively from the first episode, so we really need to wait and see how long the entire series will go if it maintains this. But if it does maintain it, I would be very happy with this show. In actual fact, there were elements in this show that I considered an improvement from Game of Thrones. Not things that probably would matter to a lot of people, but the armor and weapons and some of the set designs and quality in the sets, I felt were all an improvement from, is it the budget from the previous series, Game of Thrones, or they just had, better consultants in, because the armor in the jousts, a lot of it were just looking pretty authentic, really immersive, realistic, and so I enjoyed a lot of those elements. When you see the knights go right up there, some of them are wearing either tunics, tabards, houplons or something over top of their armor, so cloth over armor, even as early as then. We saw sneak peeks of that in the trailer, but I was wondering if that would be a one-off. But no, there's actually some consistently well-depicted armor and weapons in this show. Some really good-looking long swords. We got to see a really fancy sword the king was holding. I believe that's called Blackfire, a Valyrian steel sword. That looked really cool as well. I even think I saw a brigandine. A red brigandine. I'm going to give broad views, and then we're going to go spoilers, of course, and then even after that, depending on time, I want to go through like a scene by scene of the episode, because usually we can catch things that we miss as we kind of relive it. Now, there has been some big concerns about House of the Dragon that we've already talked about here on Night's Watch, and that is the statements that some of the people working on the show have said about certain agendas that they were wanting to put into the show. I could see some elements of the things that they were referring to, but they weren't overdone. They weren't pushing some, subversive line. It actually fit quite naturally into the course of the episode. And some of the things that they said they were going to focus on, like pregnancy, actually feels really well done. Now, I'm coming at it from, I guess, a bit of a different perspective. I'm a father of 5. I've been with my wife through each one of her labours. And so I have nothing against them showing the difficulties that women might have to face in labour, and not to subvert the whole show. In actual fact, it was integrated into this episode in not only a natural way in terms of the editing and pacing, but it was also a pivotal plot point that was going to direct the future of this entire series. It was actually really, really, really important. And so it doesn't hijack anything. In actual fact, it's appropriately done, and it shows one of the more traumatic sides of pregnancy that I think it actually lifts the episode as a result. And this makes me wonder about the other things that they've said in regards to the agenda that they want to, inject into the show, that they wanted to make it a show about toxic masculinity and misogyny and all these other things, where if this is what their level of, I guess, view that they're going to put in, I would have no issue with it at all, because in terms of the toxic masculinity, they had a balanced counterpoint where there was a very loving and concerned husband that's front and center in this show that gave a balanced kind of perspective. And yes, you can see that there's characters who are all about being overly violent, that you might be able to say, well, that's a classic toxic masculine thing. But if it's balanced and they're showing a devoted, loving, husband and also father, I was like, that's all I've ever really wanted. That's not an issue. So all the statements that they said that they're intending on hijacking this for a certain ultra-woke agenda wasn't present in this episode and might be present in later episodes. And if it does, well, that would be a pity, because they've started off quite strongly. The characters in them, okay, there were, for me, 2 big standouts for the characters in this episode. And the other characters, even if they didn't stand out, they were actually nuanced. We saw some nuance in other, secondary characters, showing to be fairly well written, nuanced, multifaceted, that they have multiple agendas at play. The politics of this show so far are very well set up, multi-layered. It's not just simplistic kind of stuff. There's actually a lot of agendas, politics, goals, already you can see happening. And so this is a good setup for a nice, complex, medieval-themed political drama. The two characters that were the standouts for me was Matt Smith's character, really well done, honestly. And it wasn't just like, I'll need to go into spoilers to explain one of the sides to it, because he wasn't just the toxic male either. He actually showed sides of loyalty and feelings of betrayal in this episode, to the point where his actions actually seem fairly justified. The other standout character for me was the king. I was worried that he might come off too weak, wishy-washy, and from the trailers, and the thing is, he's meant to be a more gentle character, but he has strength and loyalty and devotion to the point where he was one of the standouts for me. I loved the king in this, especially for the fact that he was representing the devoted husband aspect of the episode. Now, it's not to say he doesn't make all good decisions. In fact, there's a really tough decision that, what would you do in that position? And some people will say that what he did was wrong. I could see that argument. If you try and take into account of the stakes that are at play and his needs and his desires and what were the outcomes, you can see it from his perspective. So it was actually well reflected from his side and point of view. On top of that, I like the perspective that they show of his wife as well. There's some really good things in here. Matt Smith's character, to me, though, is the standout. There is a moment where he sits down in council and there's some lines that gave me a chuckle. The lines and dialogue in this isn't cringe. So we are seeing some very well executed elements that take thought and consideration. And when I compare this to other media that I've watched recently, like She-Hulk, which they did have a political axe to grind, and how blatant in your face and just stark it was just unbelievable the amount of disrespect they showed our legacy characters and other things like that. When you compare these two, one seems to be made by people who are either blinded by their own agenda or they truly are incompetent, where this shows people that even if they do have an agenda, at least they're approaching it with thought and consideration, so much so that seems like perhaps they might have put the story first, and even if they get the message in, I'm not sure how well it's reflecting the narrative that they wanted to portray, because for the world setting, it's actually quite consistent. And I actually kind of appreciate that they are showing this aspect that women would go through in this situation. And it's the pregnancy angle. And like I said, as a father who's seen, my wife go through labor and everything, honestly, I love that they're showing some respect to those difficulties and integrating it so well. There's an interesting line in the show: "The child bed is our battlefield. We must learn to face it with a stiff lip." This is the line of the Queen in this. And okay, what's interesting about that is that's a perfectly valid perspective from where she is, that she felt her role is to provide an heir, and this was her sacrifice to provide a stable kingdom. That's actually a really noble thing to do. And they didn't shame that perspective, that she wasn't saying that she is a prisoner to this role. It's like, no, I'm facing it with a stiff lip, in the context that my husband has difficult things that he's going to need to face in his role. He needs to face with a stiff lip. This is my role. I'm going to face with a stiff lip. That's a tremendous amount of respect shown to motherhood, and that in that context that I really appreciate. And then the execution, when she said, "This is our battlefield," they juxtapose, obviously you might be able to guess there's a labor scene in this episode. They juxtapose that with the tournament, with very effective cutting between the two to give kind of a payoff to that setup, that you can see this is kind of a battlefield where she is going through pain, trauma to get this done. Almost, you could say, worse so than the guys even on the battlefield. And this shows that the execution was done with finesse, because it doesn't distract the whole thing. You're seeing this really interesting, almost poetic interplay and manifestation of the setup of that line. There's a setup and a payoff, and it's done subtly, where it's not like while she's giving birth, someone says, "Oh, it's worse in the battlefield," or they need to spell it out to the audience. She's going through more pain and trauma than anyone on about, or anything like that. It's shown, and you can obviously see through the context and the editing that this is the fulfillment of that line that she said previously in the episode, which is, Very well done. If this is the talent on display, and if it doesn't get subverted, we're actually in for a very well-made TV show so far. I don't want to overcommit to it, though. We'll be looking at each episode to see what happens, but I would give this episode nearly a 7 or an 8 out of 10, and I'm not kidding. That's pretty high praise for me, and that's me taking into account like the medieval aspects, the armor, the sets, the acting was pretty much flawless by all the people on display. Oh, look, something that I appreciate, I'm not sure everyone, but there was less lewdness. There was lewdness, of course, but there was less explicit than other Game of Thrones iterations, and it was easier for me to skip over, ignore, because I don't like nudity and stuff. I don't like overly sexualized nudity. I think sometimes nudity can play a perfectly valid role. It does make you question the use of it in this episode. Some of it, I think, is... like, maybe I'll talk about it in the spoiler section now. But overall, that's my first impressions of House of Dragons Episode 1. Much better than I was worried about. No, like I said, we'll see what happens. Let's hope that this maintains, and we'll wait and see. So now we're going to get into spoilers, and I'll actually bring up some elements of the episode right here, so we can kind of flick through and go through. So the episode begins with the setup essentially of a conflict, and there's a beautiful picture of Harrenhal here, one of the best depictions of Harrenhal's Great Hall, which shows like if the budget's better, but like this was one of the letdowns for me, where whenever there was a scene of Harrenhal in Game of Thrones, it's just that same bloody room, and then the outside set, and it didn't show the massive size that Harrenhal actually had, apart from a line. And I get those budgetary constraints, but here it seems like they've gone out and they've shown Harrenhal. Wow, they're like it looks great, and then it opens to the princess riding a dragon. Now, for me, look, she did the job fine. She wasn't standout. I'd be interested if the show's going to be relying on her to carry this series, because Matt Smith is the one who's carrying it at the moment. He has got charisma, menace. He can deliver his lines with punch. Maybe she'll come out on top. But this episode, yeah, she's a bit, I don't know, like wishy-washy. Didn't stand out to me. You can certainly see the position, though, and the setup of the conflict. And so, anyway, she looks like the dragon. Yeah, you meet this her handmaiden, and of course, this is actually in line with medieval traditions, where handmaidens are oftentimes daughters or part of noble families and things. And you find out her connection. So she's the daughter of the hand of the king. You find out her handmaiden is. It's a much larger set for part of the Red Keep here. Look at the armor. It's like that. Look, they're very, very small, like the studs, but that looks like brigandine. That's like a small studded brigandine right there. It's like, oh, and it's red brigandine. Anyway, and she walks through a couple of other sets that seem to be, decently well, like in terms of budget. It looks good. In actual fact, a lot of this looks so much better than what we've seen in the Rings of Power trailer, and it's a much lesser budget. So she comes in, she talks to the mum. This is where the mum delivers the line that this is their duty. And if they're setting up that, because the princess already mentions that she'd rather be on the battlefield, she's looking for excitement and everything. That's, like if this is her character type, it's perfectly understandable and justified for that. And from what happens in the episode, it also sets up that it might make her even more reluctant to want to get married and to have children and things. And so, again, this is all very well set up and will justify her arc if that's where they're going to take it there. This is where Matt Smith is introduced. And look, it's a strong scene for him. They do imply a certain attraction between Matt and his niece here. Look, very in line with the Targaryens. Who knows where that goes? But he is, already showing some disrespect to the king by he was sitting on the throne when she entered, and she says, this might be even considered treasonous. This is a great scene where it shows the affection for the king, for the queen. The queen is having a difficult pregnancy where she's having trouble getting comfortable, and they talk about, that that's going to be a son, and the king's even had a vision. It's a very well done scene. It establishes their relationship, and it paints the king in a good, positive light. If their intent was to be toxic male, all that stuff, they're subverting their own agenda then by making the king so devoted and caring to his wife. I personally love this as a husband, and sometimes you also feel helpless as a husband because you don't know what to do. Like sometimes there are problems that happen throughout the pregnancy and especially in labor. they capture that quite well. And this part was a little confusing for me. Now, I would assume that they must have had a list of people to go hunt down that are already pretty sure of the crimes. It seems like the setup, though, seems to be that there might be some innocent people getting wrongly accused, but it looks like they're almost grabbing random people on the street that they just start beating the crap out of. And if that's what they're wanting to show, I guess they've achieved that successfully. But if they were trying to show that, no, this is a more orderly roundup of criminals, it seems like, yeah, innocent people are getting caught in the way. Again, that could be very well the point. They punish the criminals severely, chopping off hands for theft. Some guy gets his manhood chopped off. Also, there was a murderer who was like, they're a murderer, and so Matt Smith's character goes up and kills it completely. These are all very harsh penalties for crimes, but if it's actual murder, if this is for, rape and theft and stuff, it's in line with certain periods of the past, and it shows Matt Smith's character to be a person who will act very decisively, not blink. As to the fact that he might be getting a bit of joy out of it, there's that side of it as well, but it's establishing his character. Right after that scene where we see like a cart of limbs being chopped off in response to this severe brutality, the Hand of the King is not well pleased, yet he was the one who put Matt Smith in that position to lead the town's guard. Now, the king's response actually seems mostly in line with like, well, I mean, if you wanted order restored to the city, and the fact that they're going to have an influx of new people, framed by the fact that there is going to be a tournament going on, it's consistent with what's happening. So much so, in especially like Marvel shows, the events contradict and they don't try and have them interconnect well, where this is interconnecting well. His actions to shape up the town guard is directly reflective and intentional to try and make the town safer for the tournament that's about to happen, and they've already pre-established a tournament, and so we're seeing events interconnect and how they might play off one another. This was probably my favourite scene with Matt Smith here. He came off even a bit charismatic and funny, and just because he's a good actor, he can pull it off. There was a line about sheep that gave me a chuckle, and so he's strong, he's competent, but he's also dismissive, and you clearly see he does not like this guy right here, the Hand of the King. All right, so we get to this odd. This is the first lewd scene, all right, and I don't know, we'll skip over all the naughty bits. But what's weird here is it doesn't really do much. It makes me wonder why they had it. So to be as generous as we can for this scene, it's to establish that he might have hots for his cousin because he has trouble performing. Let's just put it that way. And in response to it, she says, "Would you like me to get a girl with silver hair?" And then you see him kind of a bit mopey and fall into her arms. So we already kind of knew that he might have a hots for her by the previous scene, so this is to reinforce that, but it's said by another character, making an assumption. It's not doing much. It does introduce this character who he is having relations with, and she seems to join him at the end of the episode. They could have done it in a number of, again, it seems like needless, lewdness, because Game of Thrones, we have to have, there are some times when depicting sexual relations, actually, even though, I'm more conservative in that regard, I can see how it might push the episode in the direction or to achieve things that the creators want. I'm not sure what this is actually achieving. So then we come to the tournament scene, and some of these, jousts, these tilts, hit very, very hard. Overall, I really liked it. I liked a lot of what it was depicted. There's interesting little details that I think I just got a nod to. If you see this guy's shield here, there is a lip on the shield facing him. That lip is obviously to catch the lance as it hits the shield. If it's going to glance up and then potentially pass the shield and hit your face, there's a lip there that will catch any, shrapnel, the lance itself, from moving off the shield and hitting your head. A lot of the knights that are jousting have that type of lip on it, including Matt Smith's character. It's a little attention to detail that is serving a functional purpose. It's like, oh, there we go. Look at this guy standing in the corner there, wearing the colours, the device of his lord. Really, really good. There's a lot of good things to see in this joust. On casual viewing, most of the armor passes, but if we pause it and I look very closely, this armor looks a bit fake, a bit plasticky, and so it's not perfect, but in terms of if they just get a bit of airbrushing to give it a more metallic look, the design itself would pass my scrutiny in terms of, hey, we see, pauldrons, helmet, breastplate. It's not terrible. They do an interesting thing here in the joust. And it's this. After the first tilt, there's no pause. The guy races in with his horse, grabs another lance, and just goes on to the next tilt right away. So here's the thing about medieval joust and everything. The rules of the joust change between who was ever holding it. There was no codified official, this is how jousts are performed. There is more in today where people do recreations of jousts. They draw inspiration from one of the more common kind of ways that they could find in one area or another, but that wasn't the official codified thing. And so the fact that they're doing something different, because usually in a joust, after the first tilt, there would be a pause, rest, you get ready, you line up, and you go again. This would add a really striking dynamic if you have to get to the next lance as fast as you can without any pause. That would make things really dynamic, and I think it works. It fits well for the setting, and on top of that, it even shows some of the possible variances and differences that you could actually see in proper medieval jousts, how they might do something slightly different between another joust held by another lord in another land. So I like that. I like these small little things that we're seeing here. They have the knight asking for the favour of noble ladies on the stand. Awesome to see. We see Matt Smith's character come in to be part of the joust, and they integrate the politics in with this scene. Again, a sign of that the people who are making this, if it's the writers, the director, whatever, they're being aware. They're taking time to add interesting politics. And so the person, Matt Smith, previous to that, just had a confrontation with the Hand of the King. He's not getting along well with him. Now, I don't know what rules set up. Again, this is like a different types of joust where it seems like the contestants aren't predetermined. Matt, for some reason, maybe because he's the prince, gets to pick the contestant that is going to joust against. And he picks the son of the Hand of the King. And so already this is like a bit of a slight to the Hand of the King, especially if he's going to be a bit more aggressive, which we ultimately see Matt Smith do. He does something interesting that I'll comment on when it comes to it, but it's a great little political kind of slight to the Hand of the King. I don't like you. And it's socially set up where he has a social kind of reason to justify injuring the son of the Hand of the King in front of his face. It's a very well set up political slight that's justified by the setting. It works brilliantly. I thought it was a great move in the narrative overall. And so they set up for the joust, and something interesting happens. I think it's right here, where instead of striking at the knight, he seems to trip up the horse. I'm not sure how well executed it is, because I don't think this would make a horse trip up if you just put a stick in front of it. There's enough mass momentum that the horse would probably either just knock it out of the way or break it in two. What would have worked better, I feel, is if he aimed for the horse's neck and actually killed or stabbed through the horse's neck as part of the joust. Depending on the rules, some jousts had very little rules historically, and so because there are exceptions to the standard codified kind of thing that you see in modern day jousts, in the medieval period there are a lot of exceptions where it wasn't codified. I think they're perfectly justified in doing whatever they want. Now, honestly, even if it was all medieval jousts were done a certain way, it's fantasy, it's their own adaptation, they can have these variances, and by context, we do need to assume that this type of maneuver is allowed. Again, I don't think it would actually knock over the horse the way it does, so just watch. He just kind of slides it alongside of the horse, and the horse fully trips up. In the Hedge Knight, which is right here, this is based on our Song of Ice and Fire. Canonically, it happens before Game of Thrones, but after the events of House of the Dragon. It's the tale of Sir Duncan the Tall. Love it. But there's a joust here where, interestingly enough, one of the people, contestants in the joust, aims for the horse's neck and runs his lance right through the neck of the horse. Oh, it's right here. So the artwork is done by Mike Miller, a brilliant artist who's doing the art for my own graphic novel. But if you can see right here, this lance is going right through that horse's neck. So they could have taken inspiration from Hedge Knight and done that here, which would have justified it, because when you look closer, it wouldn't really have knocked over the horse. But anyway, he does something cheeky. He strikes at the horse instead. The the knight goes down, which is the sign of the hand of the king, and his face gets ground into wood chips by the look of it, and we end up seeing it's all bloodied and everything as a kind of FU to the hand, which would just deepen the resent further, of course. But he isn't like chastised for it. It seemed like a valid maneuver, and he wins that joust, and he asks the favor of the handmaid, which is the daughter of the hand of the king. And so the insult is just laid again and again, and it's all done subtly by being shown. It's very well executed. Like, there are some significant strengths to how this episode is done. So episode 1 is good. Will we see it continue? I hope we would. I want something good, okay? We need something good. This is where we get one of the cuts to the labour scene, and things are not going well at all. The baby isn't coming out. It's in breech or something where it's not properly turned. And look, I was in a situation one of the labours with my wife where one of our children was not coming out correctly and needed assistance. And if you don't have modern technology, these things are life-threatening. And so they don't really know what to do. I think it's just set up that problems are happening at the moment, and they might have to make a very difficult decision where the king might have to choose between saving the baby or letting them both die. It is also mentioned a bit later that there's a chance that maybe they'll both live, but it's unlikely. Things are very dangerous. And from the counsel that the king is given in this scene specifically, it seems like from the king's perspective, it's either save the baby or they're both going to die. And so if the king is dealing with that horrible situation, the mathematics then has to come into play, and you have to try and save the only life that's possible of being saved. And they explain that they might need to do essentially a cesarean, but they probably don't know how to do it well with the technology that exists. And women mostly die when this is done because of blood loss. And so it's a very high, basically guaranteed fact if they do that, the queen will die, but they'll save the baby. Horrible situation. And what I really appreciate is that they show the king in agony over this decision. They don't cheapen or make him come off as crass or unfeeling or uncaring for the life of his wife. And I'm so glad that they did. If they just all men bad, and he's like, that would really seem off, but they don't. He's a loving father, and it just makes my heart break for this character and make me like this character more for the hell he's going through, and the fact he's trying to do the right thing with the knowledge he has, because he needs a male heir for the stability of the kingdom. And, we're in spoilers now, so the baby does not live, and that is going to set up the entire series as for the fact that now things are going to be horribly unstable. Granted, it might have been unstable if the baby did live anyway, because there could have been challenges, but there would be less valid challenge to the succession if he had a male heir. I think perhaps this is where there is a sept. He explains that there's a way to save the baby, but with the blood loss, the wife will probably die. It's your choice. Now, this is the thing. This is probably where people would try and claim that something really problematic happened, and it's that the king doesn't give the wife the decision. He makes the decision for her, and as we see later on, when she doesn't know what's going on, and she then cries out in confusion and cries for them to stop, and he has to grit her teeth and basically apologize, and he feels he's doing the only right decision in the moment. Yet, I think people will claim that it's very problematic that he doesn't give any agency to his wife for that decision. Granted, she is very delirious, and you could say that she's not thinking straight. I know what I've done with my wife. We've just had frank conversations about if anything really happened, serious happened in pregnancy, we make the decision of what we would do beforehand so my wife can have her input when she's thinking lucidly and not when she might either be under the effect of certain drugs or under immense pain and she's on the verge of unconsciousness and stuff. So we know what her wishes are. And my wife's wishes, which seem to be more commonly represented by a lot of mothers, is that they would be willing to sacrifice their own life for the life of their own child. And I don't want to add a headcanon and say that perhaps the Queen said that to him. It would not be outside the realms of possibility, but it's not established in this episode. And if anything, this episode seems to show the Queen not wanting them to do the cesarean and to try and risk a natural birth, and the king taking that choice away from her. And if anyone is trying to be as critical of the king as possible, that's the area that you could try and claim that? And is that when they're trying to show certain elements of misogyny? The thing is, though, from the setup of the scene, the king has very little choice, and you understand why he makes the choice overall. And they show it that it's really, really hard for him to do. So even if that he is robbing the wife of a choice there, you can see that from his perspective, he thinks is doing the right thing. And so I actually like that they show that conflict, and it makes it even harder for the king when the queen tells them to stop, and he has to just suffer through it. It's heartbreaking and it's awful, and that type of conflict, honestly, for me, it endeared me to the king's suffering, the queen's suffering as well, and it lifted the show as a result because it was willing to show such a raw, difficult, reality that these characters are facing. We cut back to Matt Smith, jousting against this knight in particular. I think he might be appearing a bit more later on because he's basically been dominating the joust so far, and there's going to be a fight between him and Matt Smith a bit later on. And so they cut between that and the labour scene, kind of reflecting again that payoff where this is a mother's battlefield is the childbed, as they say. If they're paying off that in a really interesting way, and I think it works. Cutting back to the joust, Matt Smith's character actually knocked off his horse, and then they go to a fight. Now, it's a flail and a shield versus longsword. Well, it looks to be like a bastard sword and shield, but it doesn't look to be just like a straight-up arming sword that Matt Smith is using. So we see the flail right there, and look, that looks to be a longsword, like a nice slender one. I like the sword. I'm not a fan of his armor. I think, look. Yeah, it's too much of an open-faced helm for a joust, for one. And it's too stylized, goth-looking. I do not like his armor. I like his sword, though. And so, sword and shield versus flail and shield. I'm critical of flail. I don't think it's a great weapon, but there are areas in which you would get certain advantage of, which I've always acknowledged. And against an opponent using a shield, that's one of the advantages of a flail. Flexible link, it can actually wrap around the shield and still hit the opponent. So this is actually one of those situations which a flail is an effective pick. It's probably a better pick than the sword, especially fighting someone in armor. And so one of the ways that you mitigate weaknesses of flail is a shield, and the character's using a shield. And so if people are thinking, I'll hate this scene because the flail, no, I think it's an appropriate enough pick. Flails did exist in the medieval period, not as much as people. People represent in modern media far more than they were represented in the medieval period, what we can infer from art and things, but they absolutely did exist, as we can see in medieval art. There are too many cuts in this fight scene for me to really gauge the combat itself. Wide swings, blocking, hitting. I like Matt Smith's move where he kind of boots him down at one point right here. It's like, okay, but again, there was too many cuts to see the setup. If it was vulnerable, it's effective and achieves what it needs to do. At this point, the flail is wrapped around Matt Smith's sword, and look at these weird kind of scale fold things. I hate his armor. I like this other guy's armor. It seems to be cheaper, yet it's more authentic. I like his armor better than even Matt Smith's fancier stuff. It cut back to the baby actually being delivered. Graphic, lots of blood. It cuts back to the prince, him being cocky, and again, back and forth. It's a very well-edited sequence, honestly. So what you would want to usually do is have your opponent say they yield and the fight is over. He's just taking for granted that he knocked the guy off his feet and is defeated without looking back, showing his cockiness. And then the guy gets up because he didn't yield, still knocks him in the back. It's like, a bit of a cheap move, but hey, the fight's still going. He put his guard down, and now he goes for the sword, doesn't get it. He pulls out a dagger. I was like, oh, do we get some grappling? But no, and the guy defeats even with the dagger and forces Matt Smith's character to yield. And I was wondering how far they're going to make, the prince be scummy if he's going to say, I yield, and then stab him in the back. And they don't. It's like, so they're not making his character completely full-blown scummy, where he actually obeys the rule of the joust, and he yielded. He lost, and he seems to take the L, as it were. Cutting back, and the queen is basically dying, and the king is, just devastated. So they're not cheapening his choice in the slightest. And so it seems like they're setting up this character as like, oh, he's from Dawn. He might, might be a love interest of some kind. He asks for the favor of the princess. She goes and gives it to him, and then we cut back to the labor scene. We saw the queen, lots of blood, and she's passed away. Cuts to the funeral scene, and we assume it's for the queen. And then we have a close-up of the baby being wrapped up as well, and confirming that the baby also died. And the king is obviously heartbroken to the point where the king is having trouble doing anything. And this shows an interesting side to the prince's character. He goes to his daughter and basically says, the king needs you. You need to do this for him, showing support from the brother for what the king is going through. And so Matt Smith's character isn't a complete, complete a-hole. He has loyalty and affection for his brother in interesting ways, and I actually like how they execute it. Interesting scene here where the hand of the king is met by his daughter, and this is kind of revealed that that is his daughter, though it might have been mentioned somewhere previous. And he seems to try and push for an interesting plot, which reveals additional layers to his character. They're not positive layers, but they make him a more complex character overall, and is sending his daughter in to comfort the king. What really seems to be the underlining kind of implication is that he wants his daughter to end up having a relationship with the king, to marry the king, which would then obviously empower his house if his daughter ends up becoming queen, and under the guise of sending his daughter to comfort the king in his hour of grief. Like I said, it adds more layers to his character, and that he has plots of his own, trying to scheme. The daughter isn't exactly sure that, this is appropriate, like in his chambers, but he encourages her, tells her to wear her mother's dress even, and she just comes in, offers to read him a story. The king is a little confused, and she does something which honestly I think works for where these characters would be, where she mentions that when her mother died, very few people said sorry to her and were trying to say veiled things about politics and other things. And so she just seems to be, she says how sorry she is to the king. The king responds positively to that, in the sense that this is one of the few people that have offered true remorse for what's happened. This is well informed by one of the previous scenes, which were all his councilmen coming in, and instead of saying, we're so sorry for what you've gone through, my lord, and all that stuff, you've lost your wife, the person you love, they're talking about the succession, and the king snaps because no one is caring about the fact that the queen, his wife, died. Then she comes in, offers that compassion, and so you can see why the king would respond positively to that. This is all very well done character work. This is an interesting scene because the prince feels that he should have been made hand of the king because he doesn't like the actual hand, but he also says he would be loyal to him, and he says something interesting which you could see why the king wouldn't respond to. He says, you're weak, to the king, but then he contextualizes it in an interestingly compassionate way, but not completely. He says, you're weak, and all the people on the council know it, and they're taking advantage of you, and they're all... And so... bad way to put it, but it seems like the prince is actually revealing a concern for the king. He actually, in this moment, almost seems like he does want to support the king to prevent people taking advantage of him. And just bear in mind, people literally are taking advantage of the king, manipulating his grief, and could you say, is it justified for what, the prince said, Matt Smith's character said? Because what the prince said was insulting, dismissive to the baby. And so this is all very good conflict. It can lead to a discussion of, is this actually justified? And look what I'm talking about with the prince here, is that there is an element of concern and compassion and support, even if he delivers it in a really kind of arrogant way. You're weak, but everyone's taking advantage of you. I'd protect you from people taking advantage of that. Doesn't work. The king is very angry, and he basically says, you're not my heir anymore. Go back to the Vale, your wife, and the prince doesn't like his wife. And this is where the big conflict begins, because we see that, the prince, he doesn't exactly leave in the most submissive way that he can. Yeah, this is the sort of thing that's Blackfire. It's like, hey, I like the design. It looks cool. And they're building up the conflict. The prince steals the dragon. She kneels. She's basically going to be the official heir. What will happen? And some of the statements that the people have made, that they want to try and inject statements, a conversation about toxic masculinity, about how people will not, there's going to be people who will not accept her as the queen because she's a woman. The thing is, though, it's well justified in the story, the history of Game of Thrones and what has already been set up. And so the people that are going to have an issue with her, a woman, being announced as the heir, is already set up. There are parallels historically. There's interesting conversations that you can look at as to why men stereotypically have been considered need to lead countries, and it's more tied into warfare, okay, primarily. But there's been queens that have bucked the trend and also been able to lead their nations up to great prosperity, and there's people that have resisted it. And so, like I kind of started this review out with, if their execution is actually going to be balanced and more nuanced in a realistic way, and they think that they're serving an agenda by depicting people resisting the fact that there might be a queen on the throne, if it's actually executed in the same way that this first episode is, they're not really getting their message across the way that they want. And if they're sacrificing their agenda for the sake of good storytelling, to the point where it's a nuanced story, yeah, like, I'm all on board. I'll be very interested in the conflict, will she be accepted as the queen, and if what people will do if they are not willing to accept, and all that stuff. And so far, it's actually a very promising opening. I do need to preface and kind of maybe quench my expectations because we've been disappointed before, all right? So we need to see where this series goes, because it could go completely off the rails. So I'm not giving the series a complete, hey, this is great. It's a promising opening. I do have to admit that. If you've seen it, let me know what you think in the comments below. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And of course, I'll see you on the next episode review, because we always here stay on watch.